All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's live cooking demonstration. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm the Wellness Program Administrator here with Georgia State University's Employee Development and Wellness Services. By trade, I am a registered dietitian, and I'm very excited to be sharing a new recipe with you all today. Before we get started, just a couple quick things. We are going to be recording today's session, so if you want to share it with a colleague or view it again later, it will be available on our EDWS YouTube page. There you can find previous recordings of cooking demonstrations, guided meditation, yoga, and more. So we encourage you to check that out, and we'll provide a link at the end of today's session. Throughout today's presentation, if you've got any questions, comments, audio-visual issues, let us know in the chat. My colleague Cheryl Johnson-Ransaw is joining me today, and she'll be able to assist with any issues that may come up. Please, when you send a comment, make sure you send it to all panelists if you have an audio or visual issue. That way Cheryl can see it and help as well. And then for comments or questions related to the recipe and the demonstration today, please put those in the chat and we will be sure to address them at the end of today's presentation. So today we're going to be making a vegetarian taco salad. This is a really straightforward recipe. We're actually going to be using quite a few already prepared store-bought ingredients. It helps speed things up and keeps the recipe nice and simple while still maintaining the nutritional qualities that we're looking for. In terms of equipment, you're going to need a basic cutting board, a couple mixing bowls, and then we're going to be using a large skillet on the stovetop. Now there is one step I've gone ahead and done, and that is preparing our rice. We're going to make 3 servings of this today, so you're going to need about 3/4 cup of cooked rice. So that'll be roughly about 1/3 cup of uncooked rice. So I've gone ahead and made that just to save us time, and that's already ready on the stovetop. So the first thing we're going to do is, using this large skillet, we're going to be cooking things in different waves. We're going to start off with some corn and some onions. We're going to get them to start cooking a little bit. Onions are a great aromatic, and it'll start to fill the air with some of that smell, and it'll really contribute flavor to everything else. So we are using 3/4 cup of corn. I'm using a no salt added canned corn, so this saves us time. It's very affordable as well. And the reason we're doing no salt added is we want to make sure that we are keeping the sodium level in a reasonable range so that this recipe can stay heart healthy. And we're doing that in a couple different ways, which we'll talk about throughout the recipe. So 3/4 cup of corn, it's roughly half a can. And then we're going to do 1/4 of a large white onion that we've gone ahead and diced. So we're going to start by putting a tablespoon of cooking oil over medium heat. You can use a cooking oil of your choice. I'm just working with canola oil today, so let's get that started. So 1 tablespoon. And again, we're doing that over a medium heat. I'm using a large skillet. You can get by with a medium skillet for this recipe, but if you've got a large one, it'll make things a little simpler. So we'll give that oil just a second to heat up. But as I mentioned, all we're going to need is the stovetop and the cutting board for today's recipe, keeping it nice and simple. So let's go ahead and add in our 1/4 of a large white onion and then our 3/4 cup of our corn. And we're just going to stir this around in the skillet. We want it to have contact with that oil that we laid down and heated up. And we want to make sure that it's spread out in an even layer so that it can cook evenly and have access to that heat. So we are going to cook that for about 5 minutes or until the onion starts to brown slightly. We're going to keep an eye on it. We are going to stir periodically so nothing sticks to the bottom of the skillet and burns. In the meantime, let's prepare some of our vegetables. So we are going to use 2 medium-sized tomatoes today. What we're going to do is half of one of these tomatoes is going to actually go into our skillet mixture, and we're going to heat it up and cook it with everything to add some flavor. The rest we're going to keep fresh and cold, and we're going to mix it into the salad portion later. So we've got a heated and cooked portion we're working with, and then the salad portion as well. And those will kind of be 2 separate parts of this. So whenever I cut tomatoes, I always use a serrated knife instead of my usual chef's knife. The reason for this is tomatoes are a little soft, a little squishy. So when you press into them with a knife, a lot of times it will squish things down and not cut as well as we want. A serrated knife has these teeth on it. They give it a little bit more grip, and I find it makes the process easier. So as I mentioned, we're going to put half of the tomato into the cooked portion of our skillet. So I'm just going to essentially cut this into little slices, and then I'm going to run my knife back in the other direction to give it into a sort of a coarse chop. We don't need to be super fine for this. We're not trying to do a really precise dice like you would in some recipes, or if you were preparing, like a salsa or something like that. We can keep the chunks pretty decent size, salad size, if you will. They'll also cook down some in the heat. So tomatoes are a frequent star of our recipes here on the cooking demonstration program, and that's because they are so nutritious for us. They're packed with vitamin A, vitamin C for our immune system, and lycopene, which is an antioxidant that has some cancer-fighting properties. So I'm going to take the half of the tomato we cut up and set it to the side. And then while this continues to cook, we're going to go ahead and cut the remainder of these tomatoes into similar coarse-sized pieces, but those are going to go in the fresh salad section. I hear some sizzling, so I'm going to briefly turn my attention and give a quick stir. And again, our goal is to have those onions lightly browned. So let's continue cutting into our tomatoes and getting those nice and chopped, remembering to separate that first half of the tomato you cut into its own pile. And you can see as I cut with the serrated knife that it works pretty well. It cuts right through the tomato and doesn't have quite as much of that squishing and struggling to cut effect that the chef's knife often will. If you only have a chef's knife or another knife, you can get by with it. I just find this makes things a little bit easier for us. And we'll repeat that process on this other tomato. Another thing that tomatoes bring to the table is they are a good source of fiber, which we talk about fiber in all the demonstrations because we always have at least one good source of fiber in our recipe. Fiber is great for helping with healthy digestion. It can help with healthy blood sugar, cholesterol control, and it can help us feel full and satisfied on fewer calories, which is great for maintaining a healthy weight. And we'll have some other sources of fiber contributing to this recipe as well. So continue cutting this last portion of the tomato, and then we will be good to move on to our next step. You will hear the corn and onion continue to sizzle as you cook. That's a good sound. You'll probably smell it too, and you're going to smell it even more once we add in some of our other flavorful ingredients. And something about this recipe is there's definitely a lot of room for substitutions. If you're not a big fan of onions or corn, you can take those out and swap them as desired. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So we've got a couple more minutes over here for this to cook, probably about 1 or 2 more minutes. I'll give it a quick stir again. And I can see some of those white onions starting to lightly brown, so I know that we are getting close, which is great. So what we're going to do in the next step is after that's reached that 5-minute mark, the onions are browning a little bit, we'll add in our half of a chopped tomato, and then we're going to add in a couple other ingredients. We're going to use half of a cup of reduced sodium beans. They're going to provide a lot of protein to this recipe, our main plant-based source of protein, and they're going to provide some fiber. I'm using Kroger's organic brand, and I'm not using it specifically because it's organic. I'm actually choosing the organic brand because it is lower in sodium. Now, that is not always the case, but if you look at the nutrition label, whenever you're comparing items at the grocery store, you may find that some varieties have a lower sodium content. And that's exactly what I was looking for in this. So this is Kroger's tri-bean blend. So it's pinto, black bean, and kidney beans. You can do a mix of them like that, or just use pinto beans or just black beans. That's up to you. But we're working with half a can for this, and we're going to go ahead and add those in here. And we're going to also add in those coarsely chopped tomatoes. So let's do the beans first. Okay. Remember, we're just adding these tomatoes that we've divided, so we're keeping these for our salad portion. All right. We're going to add half of a tablespoon of chili powder. It'll give it a small amount of heat. I promise it's not too spicy if you're worried about spicy foods, but it'll give it a little bit of a kick, make it a little more interesting. So half a tablespoon of chili powder. And then the last ingredient we're going to add here is I mentioned that I had pre-cooked 3/4 of a cup of rice. So I'm just going to add that into the mixture here so it can heat up with everything. And it's already cooked, but we want it to heat up with these other things, pick up some of the chili powder and the tomato and get some of that flavor. So we'll just scoop that in. And then from here, we're just going to stir everything around so the chili powder can come into contact with the beans, the corn, the onions, the rice, and the tomatoes. So give it a good stir, and then we're going to put it back on the heat for another 5 minutes. So during this time, the tomatoes are going to cook down some. Some of their juices are going to seep into the other ingredients, which will give them a little bit more of a complex flavor, which is nice. And then in the meantime, we can work on preparing more of the salad portion of today's meal. So using a medium mixing bowl, doesn't have to be too big. It just needs to be able to fit the rest of your tomatoes. We are going to add in these tomatoes to the mixing bowl. And we're going to use a little bit of a cheat today. We are not making our own salsa. It's a little more time consuming. But what we're going to do is we're going to take 1/3 of a cup of prepared salsa. So this is just medium salsa from the grocery store. We're going to use 1/3 of a cup of it, and we're going to add it to our coarsely chopped tomatoes. And essentially what we're doing here is we're getting some of that salt, some of that nice rich flavor from the prepared salsa, and combining it with more fresh tomatoes. What this does is it's going to add more of the vegetable content. We're getting more tomatoes in, more of that lycopene, vitamin A, vitamin C, that fiber. And then we're going to borrow some of the flavor from the already made salsa. So we're kind of just enhancing the natural flavor of the tomatoes with the salsa. So what we'll do is we are just going to stir that around so that the salsa is in contact with the tomatoes, adding some of that salt. And you'll notice that we haven't added salt into our dish, just table salt for cooking. We don't really need that in this recipe because the canned beans have a little bit of salt in them. Chili powder has a small amount of salt. The salsa is contributing some salt. And at the end, we'll have some cheese and some tortilla chips, which will both add salt as well. So this is kind of a tricky thing. Whenever we're making food at home, we want to be aware not just of the salt that we add in from the salt shaker, but also the salt in all of our overall ingredients. So that's how we're keeping it heart healthy. So just mixing this around, we've got the salsa in contact with those tomatoes, and we will set that to the side. We'll give this a quick stir again. And you'll find the chili powder does a nice job. In addition to flavoring things, it adds that nice kind of red coloring to everything. The rice soaks some of it up, the beans, the corn, the onions. Gives it a very appealing color, which when we look at something, how it appears to us is a big part of how it tastes as well. When we see things that are bright or colorful or interesting, it does make us more excited to eat it. It can help stimulate our appetite. So that's just a fun bonus of the chili powder. So we'll set the cutting board to the side. And what we'll do is we will get our salad bowl ready. Now I've got this giant pink mixing bowl here. We're going to make use of that today. If you've got a big mixing bowl, or if you plan to have leftovers, you may just want to mix this in a Tupperware container to start with. What we'll do is we're going to use 2 cups of greens. Now these can be whatever greens you like for the salad. Chopped romaine is a great way to do it. That's frequently what's used in taco salads. I'm just using a kind of spring mix here. It's got a couple different types of leaves in it, but we're going to do 2 cups of that, and we're just going to add it to the bottom of our bowl. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add in about 3/4 of our tomato salsa mixture here. And the reason we're not adding it all in is we're going to save the last little bit as sort of a garnish to go on top of the salad to make it look a little bit nicer at the end. So most of it going in, and we'll reserve just a little bit of it. And now we're going to go back over here, turn our attention, and stir again. And let me show you real quick. You can see how things are starting to brown. The rice has picked up a lot of the color from the chili powder, like I talked about. The tomatoes are cooking down. The onions are nicely browned. So we'll give it about 30 more seconds, and then we'll be good to add it into our salad. And I'll actually go ahead and kill the heat, and we'll just let it cook for the last couple seconds there. So the other 2 ingredients we haven't added yet are going to be our cheese. We're going to make use of just 1/2 cup of cheese here. Cheese is delicious. I love it, but we always want to watch the portion size. So we're using half a cup. We're going to add a little bit of it into the salad itself and toss it. And then similar to the tomato mixture, we'll save the last little pinch of it as sort of a garnish on top to make it look nice. Now, if you're just meal prepping for yourself, you may not need to worry about these steps. You can throw everything in at once and just have that even distribution. But if you're maybe serving it at a dinner table or for guests, you may want to do the little garnishing just so it has that nice presentation when it comes out. So let's go ahead and grab our bean mixture. And being careful because it is, of course, hot, we are going to scoop that onto the salad. And one thing I'll note is the ratio of the mixture, the bean mixture to the leaves or the greens. You can change that however you want. If you want it to be more of a proper salad, you may want to add more greens, or you can keep it like this, entirely up to you. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to take roughly 1 cup. Now you can be exact with this if you really want to, or you can just kind of eyeball it. 1 cup is roughly the size of your clenched fist. You can see here next to the cup that my fist is about the size of a measuring cup. So that's a nice little trick you can do there. But we're going to take about a cup of chips. And the chips are kind of irregular in size. You can see they don't pack down exactly. So we'll stack a couple of them. That's, I'm going to say, roughly a cup. And with clean hands, of course, if you're serving to other people, we're going to just crumble those over the taco salad mixture. Now you can use any style of tortilla chips you want. These have a little bit of lime in them, which I think adds some fun flavor. So that's what I'm doing. And then now we're just going to toss this mixture together. So we're getting the tomatoes, the rice, the beans, the corn, those tortilla chips, the salsa, everything getting tossed around to distribute those flavors. And so we've got our nice mixture there. And then, oh, I forgot to add a little bit of cheese. Again, reserving just a bit at the end. And as we add the cheese into some of the warmer ingredients, it'll start to melt a little bit, which I think is really nice. That kind of gooey cheese texture, it'll stick to some of the pieces of the beans and the tomatoes, and that'll taste really good. All right. And then for our final piece here, like I mentioned, we are going to add the last bit of tomatoes as sort of a garnish, like in the picture we showed at the beginning, and then sprinkle the last little bit of cheese on top. Okay. So obviously it's a very large salad just kind of in the bowl there. I'll serve some here because it'll look a little nicer if we plate it in a serving dish. And like I said, this makes about 3 servings. The servings are pretty large because it's a lot of volume with things like the greens and tomatoes, but it's actually not that dense in terms of calories. There is our taco salad served there. Now, you may wish to have some additional salsa to serve with it. You can also, if you want to, cut up a lime and have a little lime wedges as garnish. I know I'm a big fan of doing that, but very, very easy recipe. About 3 servings whenever you make it, and each serving is roughly 400 calories with about 14 grams of protein. It's rich in fiber, vitamin A, and vitamin C. Tomatoes are really the superstar here, bringing in a lot of that nutritional content, but the beans and cheese contribute some protein, and then we get some carbohydrates from things like the tortilla chips and the small amount of rice. And through our portion control, we have a lot of delicious ingredients like the cheese going into it and the tortilla chips, but we're moderating them, enjoying them in those smaller amounts, and we're still able to keep things heart healthy, tasty, and within a healthy calorie range. Whenever you make this, you can keep it in the fridge in an airtight container for up to 4 days. Whenever you reserve it, it's kind of up to you how you want to handle that. So whenever you serve it fresh, you obviously have some of the cold ingredients with the hot ingredients on top of it. Some people like that mixture of hot and cold. Other people aren't as big of a fan. This is definitely a recipe that when you eat the leftovers, I honestly just enjoy having them chilled and cold out of the refrigerator. If you wanted to, you could try to heat things up, but bear in mind that the greens are not going to do super well under heat if you're microwaving them. So I do think cold leftovers are the way to go personally, but I'll leave that up to you. In terms of substitutions, as I mentioned, we used a mixture of beans here, but you can use black beans, kidney beans, pinto beans. Those are certainly a little bit closer to the sort of Mexican cuisine we're dealing with here. But if you wanted to substitute it out for something like chickpeas or another bean, you absolutely could. a lot of the flavor is going to come from the salsa and the chili powder and the cheese anyway. So if you're looking through your pantry and you notice, well, I've got this can of beans, you can work it into the recipe. I do think tomatoes are a central component, but if you're not a big fan of them, there are always other vegetables you can add into this to make it your own. Bell peppers, I think, would be an excellent substitution. You're going to get similar vitamin and mineral content, but if you prefer the flavor or texture of those more, you can work those in. Just bear in mind that different vegetables may need to cook for different amounts of time on the skillet, so you might have to experiment a little bit with that. For the rice, I recommend using brown rice because it is a whole grain and it's healthier, though I recognize that white rice cooks a little faster. If you use white rice, that's a-okay. There's still plenty of fiber and other good nutrition in this recipe. And if you're not a big fan of rice, substituting that for something like quinoa could work as well. So that pretty much sums up the recipe. It's a pretty quick fix in terms of making it. Really, the longest part is just pre-cooking the rice, which if you want to, you can do as you're preparing all the vegetables and getting everything else in play. So we are going to send out a copy of that recipe. It will include all the directions as well as the nutrition information in more detail. So if you're looking to see how it might fit into your day or your lifestyle, you can take a look at it there. I'm going to check the chat real quick and see if we have any questions or comments that I can clear up before we wrap up today's session. And I don't actually see any at the moment, so I think we are all set. So I hope you enjoyed today's demonstration. Definitely one of our easier recipes. Making use of store-bought items can really speed things up and help us out. And you can see that if we carefully balance the sodium that we add in and keep it to a minimum, we can work with all these prepared foods, these convenience foods, and still make a heart-healthy dish with a lot of vegetables in it. So it's always good to find that balance. After today's session, you're going to get a follow-up email with the recipe, a link to the recording, as well as a link to a short survey. If you could take about 2 minutes out of your day to fill that out, let us know what you thought of today's session. We'd really appreciate it. Any comments or suggestions for future sessions really help us deliver higher quality content the next time we do one of these demonstrations. Speaking of which, we do these demonstrations twice a month, typically on the second and fourth Thursday of the month. And if you're not already on our mailing list, we encourage you to reach out. You can email us at edws@gsu.edu. We'll get you on that mailing list, and each week we send out a weekly email with information about all of our events. We do things like cooking demonstrations, yoga, meditation, snack and share support group, and more. So we really encourage you to get on that mailing list and attend more of our events. And I see Cheryl just put the email in the chat. Thank you, Cheryl. So again, reach out if you're interested in joining the mailing list. With that being said, keep an eye out for that follow-up email. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.